Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be importing some UI assets into Unity to set up a UI for a game. For this demo, I'm going to be creating a new Unity project, and I'm going to be using Unity 2020 for this, but this demo should work just as well in Unity 2019.4 and even Unity 2019.2. To create this project, I'm going to choose 2D here because this changes some of the import settings when you're bringing in art assets. That makes it a really fast workflow for bringing in UI assets. Now, normally I make 3D games, and even when I'm making UI for a 3D game, I would normally choose 3D because my game itself is going to be 3D. But this demo is going to focus only on 2D assets, and this 2D template for a Unity project makes that process a lot faster and easier. So I'm just going to choose 2D here, and we give it a project name. And you want to make sure you know where you're saving your project. It's really important when you create a Unity project, it's making an entire folder. It's not making a single file. So the place where you save it, that's where the whole folder is going to be. And then everything that you make for that project needs to be within that folder. For example, if you're saving your scene and you try to save your scene somewhere else, like on your desktop, Unity won't be able to find that file. Unity can only find things that are saved inside the project folder. So I make sure I know where my project folder is going to be saved, and then I hit create. Now, if you're using an older version of Unity, the biggest difference you'll probably see from this demo is the actual interface of Unity has gone through some visual changes. So some of the shapes of icons are going to look a little bit different, but the functionality should all be basically the same, particularly for the things that I'm going to be showing. I don't think there has been any dramatic changes to UI functionality between 2019.2 and 2020. Mainly, it has been a major visual update to Unity's interface itself. Before starting this video, I created a few buttons which I'm going to use that I will set up in Unity. I made these using Figma. You could also make your buttons using Photoshop. And I just made some simple buttons. I used the gradient options for both the fill and for the outline to create sort of a button looking effect. And I made 3 different states. So this is one of the things that's important with buttons is buttons have an up state, they have a down state, and they have a hover state. With the exception being that mobile games do not have a hover state because you don't have a mouse pointer, so you don't really hover over things. You just touch things with your finger. So mobile games only have an up state and a down state. So I have created these 3 buttons and I have exported them, and I'm going to walk through the process now of importing them to Unity. If you want to follow along with this demo, I recommend that you get a couple of buttons for yourself to work with. You can make your own using Figma, or you can make them using Photoshop, and what they look like visually isn't really important for following along with this demo. One thing that is important though is that all of the buttons should be exported without text on them. I've added this button text here just so I can see what it would look like with text, but when we import it into Unity, we want to make sure that all we are importing is just the images themselves. So when I export this, I remove the text from it so that I just have the plain buttons by themselves. The other thing I'm going to be working with in this demo is some fonts. And Unity comes with only one font built in by default, and that is Arial. So I want to bring in a font from my computer. You could also download fonts from the internet, but I'm just going to find the fonts folder, which on a PC is under the C/Windows/fonts. And I'm going to scroll through here and find a font that I like. And to import a font is pretty easy. You just find the font that you want to use. I like this one here, and then you just drag it into your assets folder, and now I have imported this font. Here's another visual change to Unity. When you import a font, the icon for what the font object is has changed a bit. So if you're in an older version of Unity, you might actually see a different icon here, but if you dragged in a font, you have a font type object here that you can use to apply fonts to text that you add to your UI in Unity. Now I'm going to find the buttons that I exported earlier, and I want to make sure I'm importing these as, or I'm exporting these rather as PNGs, because that is the correct format that we want to use for buttons that will have a transparent background behind them. So I have just the buttons themselves, and they're each on a transparent background. I do have one extra one here that's in a different style, just because I want to show some of the different things you can do with buttons that follow different styles. So I have these 4 assets here. I'm going to select all of them. I'm just going to drag them into my assets folder, and this will import them. And now I have these 4 assets imported. If you had started this project in 3D instead of 2D, here's the first place where you would need to do something slightly different. And this is why I mentioned the workflow is faster if you choose 2D. So if you used 3D, these would actually import as textures by default. And so when you import these, if you're using 3D, you would have to select it and come over here to texture type. And then from this drop down, it would be set to default here, which is a texture for a 3D object. And so you would have to come down here and choose Sprite, 2D, and UI. This is the format used for both 2D objects, like for 2D games, and also for UI objects, like buttons and icons and things like that. So now I'm going to set things up on a canvas in Unity, just so I can see how all of my buttons look and how they're going to fit together. So I'm going to create game object, UI, and canvas. Canvas in Unity is a way of holding all of the UI assets together and rendering them separately from the game camera. Now you might notice when I created this, I have now this big rectangle, and I'm still scrolling out trying to see the whole thing. So this is my canvas, and this tiny little rectangle down here, this is the game view. So this is the camera that is rendering my game view. So if I had 3D objects or like a 2D platformer game, those game assets would be in this zone. UI assets go on the canvas, which is this big thing over here, and this is rendered completely separately from the game. So the UI is rendered on top of everything else, and it is rendered separately from everything else so that they don't conflict with each other. Now, if you were doing something like VR, you would want to use what's called a world space UI, which is where the UI is actually rendered as part of the world and allows the UI to go behind things. But we're not doing this for VR right now, so this is just going to be a regular canvas. When I create a canvas, the first thing that I always do as soon as I create the canvas, and this is so important, is to come over here to the canvas scaler in the inspector. So I have the canvas selected, here's my inspector window, and the canvas scaler is set to constant pixel size. This means whatever size I create things at, that is the size that they're going to be rendered. And so if people use my game on different size screens, the UI is not going to scale up to work with a larger screen. This is the biggest issue I see when I work with student projects, is that the UI doesn't scale to match the screen size on different size screens. And a lot of times you'll be working on a small screen like a laptop monitor, but then someone wants to use on a full size monitor, or even changing between a laptop and a phone. Phones are actually rendered at a very high resolution, so sometimes that causes problems there as well. So instead of constant pixel size, we want to choose scale with screen size. This will allow our UI to scale up or down depending on the size of the screen the person is using, and it will make sure the UI stays where we actually want it to be on the screen, regardless of the user's screen size. There's a couple of settings in here that you can mess with if you want to. So for the reference resolution, a lot of times what I'll recommend doing is choosing a resolution based on the screen size you're actually working at. That way, what you're previewing is actually used as the reference resolution. But you don't actually have to do that. You can leave it like this and then just make adjustments to things as you're adding them to the canvas. The other option down here is match screen width or height. The biggest reason that you would want to use this is if you expect people to use this game on different aspect ratios, not just different resolutions. So most resolutions these days are widescreen, but if you expect the user to have, say for like an iPad, which a lot of iPads are very different aspect ratio from a normal monitor, then you might want to decide if it's more important that the height is accurate or that the width is accurate, or you could come halfway in between here. But again, for this demo, this isn't really that important because what I'm doing, I can actually just make adjustments myself as I'm building it and make sure I'm testing it at the different sizes that I'm expecting it to be used at. So I'm just going to leave those settings alone, but you could change them if you wanted to. So now I'm going to place some things onto my canvas. And to do this, we're going to create some new game objects, which will also be under the UI. I'm pretty much only going to be using UI type game objects for this demonstration. So let's look through here in this list and see what kinds of things we have. So we have text, which would just obviously be for putting text on the screen. We have image, that's for images that are not going to be interacted with. Then down here we have some more interactive things. So we have buttons, we have toggles, sliders, scroll bar, drop down, input field, which is where the player can type something into a text box. And then down here we have the panel, which we will use a little bit later on to allow us to switch between different things that will be different panels in the UI, so you can have something overlaid on top of something else. And the very last one down here is event system. This is what allows your canvas to have things on it that are interacted with. And you'll notice if you look in the hierarchy that when I created the canvas, it actually created an event system with it. Here's another place where the majority of issues that I see in student projects is having no event system and then none of the buttons work. So you want to make sure that you do not delete the event system. And if you do delete it, make sure that you create another one from this menu. The event system is the only way that the canvas can accept input from the user and determine what the user is clicking on or interacting with. So I'm not going to set up functional buttons just yet. I just want to look at what my assets look like inside of the canvas. So I'm just going to create a couple of non-interactive things for now. First, I'm going to create a text. And you see here is the text in the center of the screen. If you want to see what your UI is going to look like in the actual game, you can click on the Game tab. And since I chose 2D for my project settings, it does not use Unity's skybox. It just uses a solid color by default. And here is the text that I just placed on the canvas. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the main camera the background color. I don't like this blue. They do that on purpose so that you make sure that you remember to change it. So I'm just going to make sort of a light grayish color, or maybe a dark gray. Let's try that. All right, so now I'll be able to see what I'm placing on the screen. If you are making this UI for a specific game, here's a good place where you would want to use a screenshot of the game as the backdrop behind it while you're working on the UI, so you can see how the UI will look on top of that game view. And if you don't have game assets that you're working with already that you could include in the screenshot, then just choose a solid color for the main camera that you think will sort of match how bright or how dark you expect the game environment to be. That way you know if you need to make your text and buttons be a higher or lower contrast. So I have my text here and it's using the default Arial font. So to change the font, you click the little circle here and you can choose the font that you imported. You can see automatically it changed to the font that I chose, which was Papyrus, and so now you can see that font. You can adjust the font size. One thing that's super important with fonts is you should not ever scale a text object. So if I use my scale object up here in Unity, let's scale this up and just see what happens. So when you scale up text in Unity, it gets super blurry and super ugly. So do not scale text. Instead, use the font size option. So let me be in my game view while I adjust this. You can actually, if you hover over the word where it says font size, you can drag. So you could actually see as you're changing it. You can also type in the number here. And you'll notice if I choose too large of a number, it disappears. That's because it is now too big to fit in this little tiny box that was created for it. So we can adjust the size of this box. This is not the same as scaling. This is the width and height over here in the rect transform. So I can make the height taller and I can make the width wider. And now my text fits again, and so now I could even continue going up with the font size. And I'll go back over to my game view, and now I can read the text pretty well. You'll notice it is not blurry. The sort of visual artifacts here is because I've chosen Papyrus, and so Papyrus has this sort of like notches taken out of the text. Now I have some text here, and I want to choose what this text says. Maybe this is the title for my game, so I put like game title. You might notice that the text inside of this box is left justified and aligned with the top. You can adjust that under the paragraph settings. Especially for things like titles, I normally put them in the center of this text box, and then I can control where the text box is going to go. And I probably want the text box to be centered and near the top of the screen. And you can use the X and Y position here. So if I want to be perfectly centered, I would choose 0 for X. To the left of center would be negative, and to the right of center would be positive. Now, since we set our canvas to scale with screen size, what's going to happen is if I adjust my screen size, it is going to adjust the UI to match that screen size, which is very convenient. Now, one issue though is if we go with a different aspect ratio besides 16:9, so this is widescreen. If I chose a different aspect ratio, you can see that now my text is not all the way up at the top. So one of the things that I like to do, and by the way, you can see this even more distinctly if you change to free aspect ratio. Then when you're scaling with free aspect ratio, you can see it's really kind of jumping around. So what I want to do instead is I like to work in 16:9 while I'm making changes, and then I will move to other aspect ratios to test. But since my computer is 16:9, this is kind of what I want to be previewing it on. So the binding over here, where right now you can see the crosshair, it has a little yellow dot in the center, so it's bound to the center of the screen. And if you go into your scene view, you can see this X here is showing you where the object is bound to. So for a title, I want to bind it to the top of the screen. From this little drop down here, I'm going to choose the one that has, you see the little yellow dot up at the top of the screen. And now my text object, you can see it's bound to the top. And now when I change to free aspect ratio, now no matter how I change my screen, the title is at the top. And it does scale so that it is smaller on smaller screen sizes and larger for larger screen sizes. So this is exactly what I want. Now I'm going to add just some images to hold my buttons just so I can look at what they look like. So I'm going to create an image, and for the source image, I'm going to drag in one of my buttons. And you'll see it is stretched super weird, and I don't like that. So what you can do when you import an image, and this will also work with buttons later on, but when you import an image, you can hit this set native size, and it will adjust the size of the image object based on the resolution and aspect ratio of the image that you imported. So that's usually the first thing you want to do when you bring in an art asset. So I'm going to do Control D to duplicate, and I'm just going to set my 3 buttons sort of side by side just so that I can look at them. I'm not making any button functionality just yet. I'm just looking at my art assets. So now here are my 3 different visuals for my buttons, and I can see how they're going to look on my screen with my title and with whatever I have as my background. So that is the process for importing art assets and fonts. In the next tutorial, I'm going to show how to actually start setting things up to function based on user input. So we'll set up the buttons so that it reacts to the user. We'll talk about using buttons of different visual styles. So one of the things we'll do is slice buttons so that they can be scaled to different sizes. And we'll do a few different things with button functionality in the next video. Thanks for joining me for this one. I hope you found this helpful.